Changing a country isn't easy, but change is inevitable, and the choices we make today will shape our country for generations to come. That's why we've published our first book from Australia Institute Press. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia, from leading thinkers such as Bob Brown, Sally McManus, Dr Emma Shortis, and Professor Brian Schmidt. The essays are a roadmap and a reminder that the solutions exist. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. Visit australiainstitute.org.au or follow the link in the show notes to order your copy of What's the Big Idea today.
After America is made on the lands of the Kure-Wurrung, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, we acknowledge that they and their ancestors have cared for the lands, rivers and sea, and all living creatures for thousands of generations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Welcome to After America. I'm Dr Emma Shortis. I'm Director of International and Security Affairs at the Australia Institute. It's week 2 of Trump World and the flood keeps coming. The promised tariffs are finally here. Weirdly enough, Trump is doing exactly what he said he would do.
I always say tariffs is the most beautiful word to me in the dictionary.
Donald Trump hitting his 2 closest trading partners, Mexico and Canada, with a 25% tariff on all goods and a 10% carve-out for Canadian crude oil.
China makes the fentanyl, gives it to Mexico, puts it through Canada, puts it through different places, mostly Mexico, but also a lot through Canada. And so all 3 haven't treated us very well.
Fears are growing that this could be the start of a trade war.
I am announcing Canada will be responding to the U.S. trade action with 25% tariffs against $155 billion worth of American goods.
And there could be some temporary short-term disruption, and people will understand that.
On Tuesday, American time, the United States will impose tariffs on Canada, Mexico and China. As all 3 of those nations prepare to retaliate, Trump has said that the pain is worth the price. Trump's cabinet picks are facing their confirmation hearings. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., another weirdo anti-scientist, and according to his own cousin, US Ambassador to Australia, Carolyn Kennedy, a predator, seems likely to be confirmed as Health and Human Services Secretary. Meanwhile, Trump's executive orders have put a stop to all public communication by the Health Department, the same one that RFK Jr. might end up running, and they've also banned all cooperation between the department and the World Health Organization. Last week, Trump announced that the US military will open a 30,000-bed immigration detention facility at Guantanamo Bay, the site of the infamous George W. Bush-era prison that is still being used to hold detainees from the War on Terror. Alongside his attacks on Mexico, his imperial ambitions for Panama, and his treatment of Colombia last week, Trump has been busy reminding us all of the long history of US-led violence and oppression in Latin America. Trump continues his threats to send that violence north too, to the point that the French government has actually floated sending troops to Greenland. And that's not even close to covering everything. The new administration is relentless. To talk about all this super fun stuff and more, I'm delighted to welcome back my friend, Associate Professor Clare Corbould. Clare is Associate Head of School Research in the Faculty of Arts and Education at Deakin University. She's also co-host of Deakin University's Presidency Pending podcast with another friend of this pod, Dr Zim Wakora. Here's Clare now. Clare, thank you so much for coming back on the show.
A pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
It's our pleasure. I know, Clare, that neither of us want to get sucked back into the news cycle. We want to try and resist that temptation. But I wanted to start by asking you really, what you've made of the last couple of weeks. That Steve Bannon quote of flooding the zone still very much applies. So I wanted to know what has stood out to you. What do you think really matters?
Well, it's only 10 days since Trump's inauguration, even though it already feels like an eternity. I think the one sort of overarching or meta takeaway is that if you want to be a president who can get things done, perhaps split up your terms, because it's going to give you this whole sort of lengthy period to get your ducks in a row. I mean, clearly, this was widely predicted, of course, at the point of election, that the Trump administration would hit the ground running, and indeed they have. And as you say, the irony is Steve Bannon's on the outs, but it's his method that they've taken up of flooding the zone. And I saw even just yesterday, there's a new executive order about the teaching in schools, K-12 schools. So it was just bit by bit by bit, a whole lot at the beginning, of course, 34 executive orders on the first day, which is the most by a long range. I think 9 is the most ever, and that was Biden prior to that. So, okay, but you asked about content. So what's the most important or the most consequential? Again, I would be reluctant, I think, to pick anyone out. And I know that, I've been listening to the usual podcasts and what have you, and there's a lot of attention on and sort of criticism of commentators for being vaguely hysterical. For example, the executive order about birthright citizenship and trying to change the law that says anyone born in the United States is automatically a US citizen. Oh, it'll never get through the courts, and even the Supreme Court probably won't rule in his favour, so why are people getting upset about it? And the minutiae matters for individuals and for groups enormously. I mean, people's salaries will be frozen, or they'll be sacked, or they won't be able to get Medicaid, or whatever it is. No question, the smaller or the specifics matter. However, I think the really important thing here is that it creates a complete culture of fear and of loyalty and of fealty and of, what people on the socials are calling obeying in advance. So what they're doing, even if they can't get specific things through in the next few months as a result of these executive orders, they're signalling very much what kind of behaviour will be approved and what won't. So that's what I'd say about the kind of noisy things, if you like, over the last 10 days. I don't know. I'd love to know what you think, whether you think that's a reasonable assessment.
Yeah, I absolutely do. I mean, the thing that strikes me about a lot of the coverage, and I've said this before, is that idea that, what Trump's doing or trying to do is illegal. He can't possibly do this because it would break the law, as if he cares, like as if any of them care.
Right. And as if they haven't got away with that before. And as if laws don't change, or, you stack the federal bench, as he did in his first term, with people who are willing to interpret the law in ways that are favourable. So it becomes legal. And, you and I are both historians, and it's happened before. It turns out, reasonable societies become unreasonable ones and can do quite quickly. Yeah, it's isn't that interesting? I mean, they're kind of clinging to that idea that the rule of law and that the separation of powers that has looked after most Americans, but certainly not all, that it will hold. And look, I hope they're right. Of course, we hope they're right, but it yet does seem like perhaps not. It is not how I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, look, I think it's really important, Claire, that you mentioned we're both historians. I mean, I'm very much a post-1945 girl. You go a bit earlier. But I wanted to talk a little bit about, I suppose, the rule of law and specifically the Constitution, because we've, of course, you mentioned birthright citizenship, and we've talked about it a bit on this show, and specifically how even if we agree that people are kind of clinging to this idea of the rule of law, his attempts to undo birthright citizenship are quite clearly unconstitutional. That may not matter, but that truth still holds. But I don't think there's a whole lot of understanding, especially here in Australia, about what birthright citizenship actually is, what the 14th Amendment is, or even where it came from. So I wanted to actually ask you if you could maybe give us some of the historical context around that, because it doesn't appear in a lot of the coverage.
No, it hasn't, has it? And it is important. And actually, quite a few historians saw this one coming. I mean, he flagged it in his first term. It was something he wanted to go after. Because if you can change this one, you change who is American, really fundamentally. So the 14th Amendment was passed in 1868, and as in Australia, making a constitutional amendment is a difficult process that requires, supermajorities of one sort or another. And it came 3 years after the end of the Civil War, which saw 4 million people who had been enslaved become free. And so there's this open question about what's going to happen to them. And this is where it also links already with the question of immigration. There was a very concerted campaign to send all of those people and people who were already free, mostly in the north, but also in the southern states, back to Africa, or to Africa, to put that more correctly, because by 1865, very few, like literally a handful of people had been born in Africa of those who were enslaved. And Lincoln considered this very seriously during his term, though he came by the end of the war to think that it was untenable and unfair. But it was certainly on the table, as were a host of other sort of arrangements around having a kind of form of second-class citizenship, which is actually in the end, 30 years later, was implemented widely in the South. So it's passed in 1868, which is at the height of a period that historians call radical Reconstruction. So Reconstruction is the name given to the 12 or 13, sometimes, historians argue about time, but roughly a decade and a bit after the end of that Civil War. And it's about reconstructing this nation that had been cleaved in two, and also reconstructing the South and making it a reasonable place that resembled the North in its attention to the rule of law and unlikely to secede again. And the big question was, what do you do about labour? What was going to happen to these formerly enslaved people? So that's Reconstruction, but there's a period within that known as radical Reconstruction. And this is actually I think it's the period in the United States, perhaps you could argue the 1960s, but I think the late 1860s are the period when the United States came closest to perhaps really making good on the promises in the Declaration of Independence, the preamble to the Declaration of Independence about every person being equal, in its entire history, that's the time when it came closest to making that a possibility. Reconstruction, however, was wound back very quickly after the 1876 presidential election, when compromises were made, and famously, almost none of the secessionists from those southern states, those leaders, including, Robert Lee, the president, whose name escapes me for a moment, it'll come back later, none of them are punished in any substantial way. A couple of trials. There's there's conversation about land confiscation, which would have radically also redistributed wealth, but it doesn't happen in the end, of course. So that's the moment when the 14th Amendment is brought into being. I've probably gone on too long, but that's what historians do. So what it brings into being is that rule that if someone's born in the United States, regardless of their parents' point of origins or nationality, they are American. The only exception is for children of diplomats who are not subject to US jurisdiction, but that's obviously a really minor number. And other countries have picked this up or not over their time periods, or they've had it and they've changed it. I think in Australia, there's some, if you've been here for 10 years or something, you can be natural. I mean, of course you can be naturalised here. But there's maybe a special provision. But children who are born here of non-Australian parents are not automatically Australian, so it's different here. But this has been a really fundamental bedrock of US policy for a long time, and the idea of who gets to be an American. And of course, conservatives have been wanting to overturn this for a long time, because they say, these, destitute mothers from across the border come here to have their babies. Well, actually, there's some truth in that. Of course they do. Those children may very well have a better chance in life. So that's what they do. So rolling this back is a really big deal. That's 170 years of a fundamental principle about what being an American is.
And it's such a different idea of, I think, what America is as well, what the promise of it is for other people and for its role in the world.
I agree.
And I think that's, in so many ways, Trump is kind of a historian's nightmare in that sense, in that he is bringing back or bringing this history to life in such a deeply uncomfortable and frightening way that I suppose related to that idea of America and the role it plays in the world is his revival of American imperialism at the same time.
And Panama's promise to us has been broken. The purpose of our deal and the spirit of our treaty has been totally violated. American ships are being severely overcharged and not treated fairly in any way, shape, or form, and that includes the United States Navy. And above all, China is operating the Panama Canal, and we didn't give it to China, we gave it to Panama, and we're taking it back.
which is another thing, of course, that historians like to argue about. But with his talk about expanding US territory through Greenland, and even like in his inauguration speech going as far as to talk about America's manifest destiny on Mars, which I thought was completely wild and didn't really get picked up because of, all of the other stuff in the flood. But it does, I mean, at least for me, this isn't my time period, but it does seem like really just a brazen revival of what historians will often call the quote unquote the imperial presidency. Is that how you see it? How do you think Trump fits into the history of American imperialism?
Oh, I think there's so much to unpack there, but I might start with so the moment when Americans most hotly debate what kind of power they're going to be, if you like. Are they going to be a power that, like the European empires of the 19th century, takes territory and rules over it? Or are they going to be a better force in the world, but also tacitly sort of have control in other ways? Is around 1898 and just around that kind of period, it's quite short, it's about 5 years, which is also around the time that Congress debates very seriously whether they should restrict immigration. And that's partly a result of that 14th Amendment, because people are coming in, they're having children, and enormous amounts of immigrants come from Europe in the last few decades of the 19th century. And indeed, it takes them a couple of decades, but in 1924, they radically reduce the number of people who can come in and where they can come from. And that lasts until 1965. This is all linked with that question of should the United States expand and who can be an American. So they have that brief war with Spain in 1898, and as a result, they kind of annex Cuba, right, for a time. And of course, they take the province or the bit of Guantanamo Bay that is now Gitmo, where the base is.
And a 30,000 bed detention facility. We've heard
holding
this week.
Now 4 people, is that right?
Something like that.
But a very useful kind of port in the Caribbean and off very close to Florida, off the coast. But the debate really heats up with the Philippines. Should they annex it? And an awful lot of Americans are very opposed to this because they fear that the people who are annexed will eventually have a right to become citizens, that this is an overreach, and also, though, that it will add a large population of largely Catholic, non-white people. So there's a big debate at the turn of the 20th century around whether the United States should be an imperial power. And the results are mixed. I mean, in the end, the United States has so many client states, you might say, or, we use so many terms for them, exerts its power over the ensuing decades in so many different ways that it can be described as imperial. And the thing about that description, of course, as a nation of imperial, it doesn't need necessarily to take territory, especially once communications reach a kind of maturity that means you can extrapolate resources, things that are under the ground, literally, or people, rubber, say, in West Africa, whatever it is, without actually having to pretend to be a benevolent imperial power, I suppose, in the mould of a 19th century European power. So that's going on at the end of the 19th century. Panama was part of that story. So the French, it's a bit later, but the French tried very hard to build that Panama Canal and failed dismally, mostly because they hadn't figured out that malaria is transmitted by mosquitoes. Once that was worked out, the Americans came in and, carved out a little bit of Colombia, called it Panama, and built that. It's an incredible feat of engineering, the Panama Canal. And then, obviously took possession of it until the 1970s, when Panamanians start saying, it's, we live here, maybe that could be ours. And that leads to the treaty that we've heard quite a bit about, because Carter's death coincided with Trump suddenly starting to talk about Panama. And that was implemented, I think, in 1976, with the treaty finally in place by 1999. And the United States no longer enjoys privileged rates and, kind of hegemonic or perhaps imperial power over that canal. Okay, I've done a little detour to get to the question of that imperial presidency, but let me stop talking for a moment. Maybe you want to say something before I go to that as well.
No, not at all. I think we should talk particularly about the United States' role in Latin America, given Trump's focus on that and Panama, and this idea of kind of manifest destiny in the United States' role in the Western Hemisphere. So, please go ahead. Talk to us about Panama.
So the phrase manifest destiny, and you're taking me back to teaching that I haven't done for a while, but it arises, I think, in the 1840s as the United States is solid enough, and the cotton boom of the 1810s up to the Civil War, up to the 1860s, means that more and more land is needed. Cotton's very hard on the land, and it's enormously profitable at this time for the United States. And they've got people coming in from Europe, so all the opportunities are there. In 1803, they purchased what's called the Louisiana Purchase, a huge tract of land around the Mississippi for 3 cents an acre, famously, from the French, because Napoleon's so cash-strapped because of his war with Haiti, trying to keep it a slave colony, which he fails to do. It becomes the first black republic in the world and in the Caribbean, which makes it the target of the United States from then until now. So it's got land, it's got people, it moves west, but it needs a kind of ideological justification for basically, murdering and taking the land of Native people. And the justification is manifest destiny, with all of the kind of religious overtones that has. It's accompanied by endless sort of plays. This is the 19th century, so the stage is the most popular form of popular culture. Novels, artworks representing, the angel of the United States going west, a famous sort of image of painting of this, of the wagons, and the idea of that the Western wagoners, the pioneers, all the rest of that.
Which Trump talks about all the time, that the United States being settled by heroes and pioneers and warriors.
Yep. And it's very familiar still. I mean, I'm 48. It's still kind of familiar enough from my school history in Australia, settlers and the brave and the disease and all the things they encountered, and less of the kind of, downside, shall we say, of that. And certainly Trump doesn't care about the costs of that kind of expansion. And we can see it, as you said, really, sagely, that's Mars now.
The United States will once again consider itself a growing nation, one that increases our wealth, expands our territory, builds our cities, raises our expectations, and carries our flag into new and beautiful horizons. And we will pursue our manifest destiny into the stars, launching American astronauts to plant the stars and stripes on the planet Mars.
I mean, that was clearly a sop for Elon Musk, who has no greater ambition than indeed to go to Mars. I mean, dude, don't wait. Let the door hit you on the way out. But actually, I don't know if you're thinking this, Emma, but every time I say something like that, I think, my chances of going to the US diminish by the day. I mean, I'm not that important, but maybe there could be a case where they check us at immigration and send us right back from LA. But okay, so that's the idea, right? Who's going to get there? Manifest destiny. Is it going to be the United States, or the war here will be with China? One assumes. Who else could possibly build the kind of tech in the time? Okay, we're talking ridiculous things now. Nobody is settling Mars anytime soon, but it does. He has no hesitation in thinking that that's a reasonable thing to do. Likewise, Greenland, likewise, Panama. That the Americans are best equipped to look after those places, that they are somehow superior human beings.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're so right, Claire, that it's ridiculous. It is ridiculous to think about and talk about, but it's also true that it's really violent and frightening at the same time. And I think those things kind of existing alongside each other is very disorienting and makes it really hard to talk about. And you mentioned Elon Musk. I find that is particularly the case with Musk because he's ridiculous and weird and embarrassing, but he also is engaging in the historical context of the language that he and Trump are using around manifest destiny and civilization and who gets to be American is really so important and is so easy to get lost in the kind of ridiculousness of it all. And that kind of leads me to another question that I wanted to ask you, especially as a historian, and a historian who does a fair bit of, media commentary around Trump and Musk and what they're doing, and how you're finding trying to put these things in accessible historical context, because I think it's a really hard thing to do, but it's also so important. So how are you finding it? How are you finding how the media is covering or trying to cover all of this?
It's tricky, isn't it? I think on this podcast, you and I here today can probably assume a level of knowledge of most of the listeners, right? They've probably covered some of the daily news, or they've listened to your prior podcasts that have covered the big events of just the last 10 days. Even just to do that, though, takes so much time in a media slot. Say you're on ABC or whatever for 7 minutes. Just covering that and then trying to put it into some sort of context, or to extrapolate, to think about the greater threat, which I think you have just in your question have just actually answered the first one, where I talked around it, which is what is the most important thing that's happened in the last 10 days. And aside from the grift, which we haven't talked about, and of course that is Trump's aim, but that's not everyone else's aim. It's about defining who gets to be an American and who gets the kind of spoils of that citizenship and wealth, enormous wealth, right? And capacity for more of it. And that's those what Varoufakis calls the techno-feudalists, and we can talk about that a little bit. But aside from that, it's the thing about who gets to be an American. I've forgotten what you actually asked in my getting to the answer.
How are you finding the media coverage?
Yeah. I think I just proved my own point, which is it's hard to do both at once. And I think I keep thinking actually that maybe the ABC and maybe you two and maybe us, me and Zim on our pod, which the first season of which we're finishing soon, perhaps what we need to be talking about and people we need to be talking to are German historians or historians of Germany, or mid-century, mid-20th century Europe. I think that they might even be the ones who could tell us about parallels or not more easily. I'm kind of interested in that. But there is still in Western media, care of consolidated media ownership, a real wariness about criticism, about saying boldly, which is absolutely, I think, the responsibility of every citizen who's paying any attention, is to say, this is potentially utterly disastrous. As you said, the violence in this, the unfairness in this, to think of specific examples, the dismantling of regulation of corporate and, say, technical, but corporate America, the lack of control over environmental degradation, all of those kind of really critically important things. And so when we must speak out against this, we have to put it in historical context, and we need to warn about the potential effects of the kind of things that they've been doing and that this administration's been doing in the last 10 days. But there's a wariness about doing that, of course, in many legacy media outlets. Yeah.
And I find as well there's a real reluctance to see how that potential utter disaster in the domestic United States has immediate global ramifications as well. There's this tendency to separate American domestic politics from its role in the world, and especially from our relationship with the United States. And I think bridging that gap or trying to dismantle that assumption, I'm not sure about you, but that's something that I really struggle with.
Yes, and on the local front, we've got an election coming up that could be quite important on that front. So there's a question here of who outside the United States is actually even strong enough to kind of keep this in check, if you like. Really, I think China's the only possibility. And I think we've seen a little bit of that this week with the DeepSeek announcement, although that may be a bit more froth and bubbles than it was immediately apparent. That, for any listeners who haven't been following that, is the emergence of an generative AI tech in China that allegedly has been created on a shoestring budget, which may or may not be true. Probably not. It's probably not as shoestring as claimed, but it's an interesting kind of you're not going to get that out of Europe. Certainly not going to get it out of Australia. We just don't have the labour, the wherewithal, and that's an interesting development. How about we put that way? That ironically, Trump, who wants to make America great again, may in fact usher in a time when China's rise will be facilitated with the encouragement of the rest of the world. Okay, so I'm making wild predictions now, but I don't think that's out of the question. And I think that also then means here in Australia we need, as we've been saying for a long time, as people have been, we need expertise in China. We need as much of that as we can muster. We need a much better relationship with China than we currently have.
Yeah, we need universities to do their job as well. That's probably another conversation. I just did want to say though, I have to admit to enjoying the American tech bros or techno-feudalists, to use the better term, just having a total meltdown about having some competition in the AI bubble. That was a little bit of fun. We've got to find it where we can, I guess.
Yes. Their sense of entitlement is so vast, isn't it? And that sense that they are the right people to rule the world, that this is okay to gobble up the world's resources the way they are doing. It is, Hey, I wish I had that kind of confidence.
Let's segue though from white tech bros to the role of white women, because I can't let you leave, Claire, without asking you about Melania Trump, because one of the many things in the news cycle this week was a new portrait of the First Lady and a kind of accompanying social media obsession about her missing ring. That was a big thing, that she's not wearing her ring in the portrait, but also her kind of military chic fashion that she's going with. But what I really wanted to ask you about was not the kind of shallow fashion stuff, although that does matter, but how you think Melania Trump and white women more broadly, or how we should understand their role in the kinds of historical context that we've been talking about.
That's such a rich question, I think, and a really important one that people are not talking about well enough. I mean, Trump, I'll have to go back to the image. I read it as corporate rather than military, but it might be a bit of both. And isn't she standing behind a desk? So for listeners who haven't seen it, it's black and white, and it's very kind of corporate. I'm in charge. Maybe even the next star of The Apprentice is how she looks like. She might be about to fire people. So, I mean, people have asked, and I think I was asked this on media, is all the DEI stuff, diversity, equity, inclusion, and the stuff around particularly transgender people, is that all kind of just icing, but really we need to be delving into the cake or whatever, because actually what we know is Trump's grifting. They're of a piece, and we know this from the history of the rise of authoritarian and fascist movements. You have to define who belongs and in what capacity. And if you go back to Project 2025, which Emma, I know you know really well, and their manifesto, their 900-page manifesto, which is only the latest of their kind of attempts to shape policy, it's all about women raising children, being in the home. It's all about straight relationships. So it's a kind of defining of society in particular ways. And we know historically that often white women have aided and abetted this because they have individually and collectively assessed the risk and decided to throw their lot in with those who are powerful. And of course, it's not every person, and there are exceptions in other groups as well, but they have helped create pro-natalist politics that then feed into that idea of who belongs. So it's that idea that women who are already proper, if you like, that's inverted commas for those listening, proper citizens, proper Americans in this case, are the ones who have the children, then you're not reliant on immigration, and nor is the status, if you like, of the primary citizen, which is the man and the breadwinner, threatened. And so, that's how I would, I think, respond to that. And given we know that white women have voted for Trump in much greater proportions than women of colour, they're right up there with the establishment of this regime, as far as I can see. Is that how you'd read it as well?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think there's a real tendency in media coverage, and particularly social media as well, to see Melania Trump as a victim, to see her as trapped, when she's not a victim, she's a collaborator and an enabler.
Well, she may also be a personal victim of Donald Trump's avarice and whatever else. But yes, she is that too. And I think the time she wore the jacket about the separated children or whatever, I think that was the case.
I really don't care,
centers.
do you?
I really don't care, yeah. And in the khaki military colour, she made very clear where her politics lie.
Yes, I think her politics are really clear, and that's one of the things that I think we need to keep doing, and the media need to keep doing is recognise that when people tell you who they are, you should pay attention. And I appreciate so much, Claire, your ability to do that and to add such necessary historical context to our conversation, which I am sure I'm going to drag you back to do again. But for now, thank you so much for your time.
Emma, it's always such a pleasure to talk to you. I love this pod, and your title, After America, that, listeners or others may have thought was a bit overly dramatic, is now seeming prescient and, brilliant. Ballsy and brilliant.
Thank you so much, Claire.
A pleasure.
This episode was recorded on Friday, the 31st of January. No doubt a bunch of stuff will have changed since then. If you're enjoying After America, please leave us a rating and review on your podcast platform of choice. And we'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to us on social media. We are at the Oz Institute, that's with an AUS, on Twitter and Instagram, and at australiainstitute.org.au on Blue Sky. And you can send us feedback and episode ideas via our email address, which is podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. We'll be back next week. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.